the idea that everything you do has to be associated with real-world problems because that's how kids learn best. Real-world problems are often ineffective for initial teaching because they have so many features that cause misconceptions. They can also lead to overly specific learning that doesn't transfer to the students. And one famous experiment is that a few minutes of abstract instruction, in other words, of just explaining how it worked verbally, enabled novices to learn what it took experts years to discover through real-world experience. This is a famous study. It's called, it has a crazy name, it's called sexing chicks, is what they call it in the industry. It's determining the gender of a chicken. It's been hatched. And experts would go and, they would study years under apprentice to go and look and try to determine if it's a male chicken or a female chicken. And the scientists would go and ask these guys, well, how do you know? You're pretty accurate in determining this, and it's very hard to determine the gender of a chicken so early. How do you do this? And, oh, I just know. It's just this sort of, it's almost this mystical thing that, and the scientists are saying, it can't be this mystical thing. There's got to be something you're looking at that you're just not, you just don't know what you're looking at, right? And so they finally figured out what the features were. They taught them through a sequence of examples, and within a few minutes of explaining, this is a male, this is not a male, this is a female, this is not, and doing that, just kind of like we did before, these guys were able to go and do a higher accuracy rate than the folks that have been doing it for years. So this idea of just explaining things in a logical way has a lot of power. All right. The principle here is when you develop activities and practice problems, we're not against real-world problems. They can make excellent motivators, but the thing that you should really focus on is the cognitive processes, the thinking that the problem requires, not the real-world trappings. And so that's the difference, is that sometimes problems that are actually completely made up and impractical are really neat puzzles. And so that's what matters, is what the kind of thinking you do, not whether it's a real-world problem or not. All right, so constructivism also goes along with this idea of discovery learning versus rote memorization. You'll hear this over and over again. Oh, we can't have kids learn facts, that's just rote memorization. You'll hear that over and over in the progressive circles. And so what it is constructivism is actually correct. Constructivism is the name for the philosophy or the theory behind disparaging rote memorization. And it's based on the belief that learners create their own knowledge structures rather than having someone just tell them. And that's true. That's true. It's true that learning is an active process. It's true that you discover, you develop your own understanding of things. But there's very little positive evidence for discovery learning. So if you're doing a science experiment where you're expected to discover a scientific principle and you don't have the requisite knowledge to be in a position to try to do that, you're going to spend a lot of time just going in circles and wasting your time and actually be less motivated than if you had had the requisite background knowledge. So there's also this notion of rote memorization. So the first stages of learning involve acquiring what's called inflexible knowledge. Inflexible knowledge is not the same as rote memorization. You have to start somewhere, and you start with shallow knowledge. It's just how learning works. And so we don't shy away from that. We expect you to acquire some facts and some knowledge and some things that are this shallow knowledge because we know it's going to lead to deeper knowledge later on. Unfortunately, many folks have decided, well, because we can't kind of jump to the end here, we're going to attempt to jump to the end and get to that deep knowledge before we build the foundation. And so that's where we would differ. By the way, I'm not reading everything on these slides because there's so much to go through. So this will be available. It is already available online if you look at our website. The other myth is fun and interesting. So the idea is that you want to make lessons fun and interesting. And hands-on learning will be more interesting and appeals to various learning styles. And you can kind of see how these myths combine and mutually support each other in some people's minds. Entertaining activities motivate students, and you can judge a lesson by how engaged students are. So that's the myth. The entertainment value of a lesson and the level of student engagement isn't the measure of lesson success, it's whether you learn. We don't kid kids. Learning is hard work. It requires effort. It requires effort by the teacher to design instruction carefully. It requires effort on the learner to be able to pay attention. And though it is good to make lessons interesting, don't get us wrong, too many activities, or those of questionable value, actually end up reducing students' opportunity to learn. Because if you're spending all your time doing these activities, you're doing discovery learning, and not efficiently getting the information and the knowledge and the skills that you need, you won't have time to do the interesting projects because you're taking too much time to even learn the basics. Our approach is that schoolwork is the work of childhood. It's certainly fun and interesting, and it can be, but it's often quite challenging, and it requires discipline. We talked in our presentation last time about character development. Character development and acquiring that discipline is an important component of our school. This is what makes learning possible, is if that you are surmounting obstacles. In our school, you will always be rubbing up against something more and more challenging each time. And you're expected to have the discipline to persevere and go through that. So our approach here is to say, yes, it can be interesting, and the content is interesting if you spend time actually learning the content. But you don't have to provide gimmicks to make the content interesting. Very often in some approaches that teachers will use, they'll try to kind of focus on all the fun aspects of it and dilute the actual content. And it sort of sends the message like, well, this content can only be interesting to you if I make it into a game. Well, sometimes a game might be appropriate, but that isn't the focus. All right. Collective teaching, I'll just go over this really fast because we're getting short on time. The idea is you can kind of mix and match materials from everywhere, and that's the best way to do things because you're supposedly tailoring it to your students. Really, if you look at the evidence, you want to have a coherent set of materials that all work together. And you can see that we've done our best to put together a coherent set of materials that are all fitting within the classical approach and that are all kind of the same thing. I mean, Singapore Math, we use K through 6. We have science books and other books that all kind of work together. They're part of the same series and take a similar approach. So it's not... It's not kind of thrown together. All commercially prepackaged materials have faults, and that's where our teachers are going to work with us and work around the faults and develop some things on their own to make up for the faults that no matter what you pick, you're going to find. But the idea is that good curriculum design reflects principles from well-conducted research, cognitive science, and psychology. It's not throwing stuff together to see what sticks. It's about design. The other myth, you see it in the movies, is the good or heroic teachers. We expect teachers to be everything and anything to everybody these days. The idea is, oh, you know, good teachers are the most important variable to student success, which we agree with. But they outweigh teaching techniques and curriculum, school climate, and organization and leadership. You have to have all those things to have an effective school. And so what we're trying to do is create an environment for teachers where they have those supports and where we don't expect teachers to be heroes, where they have to sort of assume responsibility that even though they have a bad curriculum and the leadership is bad, you have other things that they're contending with, we don't expect miracles. We're trying to surround teachers with and students with this climate of order and structure and well-researched approaches that will help improve education. All right, so those are the myths. I'll go quickly over the science. There's a guy called Daniel Willingham. He's a professor at the University of Virginia as well, along with Peter. He wrote a book called Why Don't Students Like School? And he's a cognitive scientist. He studies the brain. And if you've been around education for a while, you'll hear people make all sorts of wild claims about brain-based learning and multiple intelligence and these things that sound like they're very sophisticated but ultimately are myths. And he does a great job of exploding many of these myths. The first myth, which you could use this against your friends if they ever do something silly, you can tell them. I guess your brain's not designed for thinking. The brain is actually designed, from a cognitive science perspective, to avoid having to think. Now that may sound a little crazy, but it's actually true. And when you think about it, if you give someone a problem, and they've seen that problem before, they're not going to think about it. They're remembering the answer and they're just going to tell you. Right? So the idea here is the brain is designed to avoid having to think, because it's slow and reliable. If you are driving, you have to think about every move that you do, you're going to get in an accident. That's why there's a big difference between novice drivers and people who've been driving for a while. But what does work though, if students think a problem is solvable, if what you do is you give them a problem that's challenging, not overwhelming, but challenging, they think they can get it solved, they will actually be motivated to think. Because what they will do is they think that they're going to experience success and that rush that comes with success. And so what you want to do is design some instruction around these small increments where students are constantly getting things that are just a little bit more challenging than what they did before, and they're constantly experiencing success. So you get this kind of snowball effect of positive feelings and emotions and motivation for the students because they're never overwhelmed, they're never bored, but they're just constantly stretching themselves just one little bit and they experience success with it each time. Factual knowledge has to precede skill. There's a lot of thought in education circles these days that higher order thinking skills and critical thinking skills, we hear these phrases thrown about, that's the thing you're aiming for. You are, but you have to make sure you have enough factual knowledge to actually engage in that. So the knowledge must be meaningful, and lists of disconnected facts are not helpful, but you do have to have a lot of factual knowledge. And so in the classical approach, what we do is in the first phase, kindergarten through fourth grade, students acquire a lot of knowledge. And then the second phase, the logic phase, 5th or 8th grade, they're taking that knowledge and they're applying their logic to reason through it. So the idea is they have such a foundation in the knowledge that they can really engage in critical thinking of a sort that you don't typically see for 5th or 8th graders. I mean, some of these 8th graders will go and pick up moot court and be debating Supreme Court cases and doing all kinds of amazing things because we systematically build up their knowledge in those early grades. All right, memory is the residue of thought. So the human memory system is designed to remember things that you think about carefully, because if you think about something carefully, it means you're probably going to use it again. So your brain just triggers things in it that will actually help you remember, generally speaking. Therefore, discovery learning should be used judiciously, since students actually can remember the misconceptions that they were thinking about when they're trying to do all this discovery learning and figure something out on their own. They can actually remember the wrong things rather than the right things. Also, we use stories. One of the things we do in history is we teach this, the story of the world, I believe, is back there. So it's a really neat book. It's one of the best history books we've seen. Becky's going to hold it up here. It's a series we use from 1st grade through 4th grade. And it teaches all of world history. Students will complete an entire suite through world history from 1st grade through 4th grade. And these stories, I mean, you were talking about, Becky, before, I mean, it's like you're on a magic carpet. Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, basically, this one was one of the ones that I had done. And it just starts out with the book saying that imagine you're on a magic carpet ride and it takes them on flight over the sand dunes and shows them what the buildings would be like and what the people would be dressed like. And it's just so much more interesting than handing them a textbook and saying, here, read this story about it. But it's amazing, and the kids absolutely.
Yeah, and it complements, we also have there are other things there. The art comes with it, so it comes with art projects. And I think
art
even some
projects
music.
And regular projects. And
all kinds of things that come with it. So in our school, when you're doing that, you're going to have, 1st grade you learn ancient history, ancient art, ancient music, and all of that kind of integrates throughout the whole year. Anyway, the idea here is we're teaching history through stories, especially in the early grades, because they're psychologically privileged, which is a fancy way of saying you tend to remember stories. You have to practice. You have to make practice automatic. That's something that classical schools do well. Typically, other models don't do that. Practice actually improves the ability of you to transfer your ideas to some other application to do that generalization you care about. And it's better to practice a small amount over a long period, so practice 10 minutes for several weeks, than to cram for the test 5 hours before. We all know this, right? You just forget it. The way we design our instruction is that kids are constantly practicing and reviewing everything they've learned all throughout the year. So by the end, they will basically have remembered what they did in the beginning because it's constantly referred to. Like in history, even across the grade levels. When you go into 2nd grade, if you're doing the Middle Ages, we refer back to the ancient history. So you're constantly going back and remembering everything and relating what you learned before to what you're learning now. There is no inert knowledge in our school. What we expect you to learn, we expect you to learn to heart, and we expect you to use it in the future. And kids, because we teach that way, quickly learn that that's how it works, and so they don't let those facts and that knowledge go away because it's coming up again.